Right, well, I think we'll make a start. Welcome everybody to this special lecture this evening on Lenin's ideas on revolution. Are they relevant today? I'm really delighted to have with me here this evening Professor David Lane, who I'll give a proper introduction to in just a moment. I'm Marianne Jump, I'm the archivist and library manager at the Marx Memorial Library. And I start off with a little bit of housekeeping about this evening's meeting. You've probably gathered that you've all got your mics off. We are also asking you to please keep your cameras off because it makes it much easier for us to organise things over here. David will be speaking for around 45 minutes, and then there'll be chance to put questions to our speaker. What we'll be asking you to do is to please put your questions in the chat, which you'll find in your menu, that little speech bubble. And we've got Alex Gordon, our chair, who's in the chat, and we're picking up any questions and putting them to myself as chair, and I'll be putting them to David. And obviously, just please do use the chat for any kind of discussion during the lecture. This is a special lecture organised jointly by the Marx Memorial Library and the Society for Cooperation in Russian and Soviet Studies on the 150th anniversary of the birth of Lenin this year in 2020. The Marx Memorial Library and SCRSS have had, the last few years, set up a kind of tradition which has been working really well of putting on joint events ever since our successful joint conference in 2017 marking the centenary of the Russian Revolution. So we're really delighted to be working together again this evening. For those of you who don't know, the SCRSS is a library and education charity that aims to promote knowledge of the culture, language and history of Russia and the former Soviet Union. And it's also an education charity as well. The Marx Memorial Library, we are a library, archive, museum education charity with a focus on Marxism and the history of socialism. And we also have a rather nice link to the subject of this evening's lecture, because in our wonderful kind of historic building on Clerkenwell Green, which unfortunately I'm not in, but you can see my virtual background, we have the room where Lenin worked for around 13 months editing Iskra in 1902 to 3 when he was in exile in London. Right, I think that's enough from me. Our speaker, welcome Professor David Lane. David is an emeritus professor of Manual College, Cambridge, a long-standing member of the SCRSS, and in fact the vice president of the SCRSS as well. And we're really delighted to have him here this evening, where he'll be exploring Lenin's theoretical and practical strategy, its criticisms, and relevant to current conditions. Right, so David, shall I press ahead with the PowerPoint?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Okay.
Is that all okay? Yeah.
Shall we start then?
Yeah, let's make a start.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your comments. Your introductory remarks bring to my mind the occasion of just over 50 years ago, when on the 100th anniversary of Lenin's birth, and this year's 150th anniversary, Professor Maurice Dobb, president of the Marx Memorial Library at that time, gave a lecture on Lenin sponsored by the Society for Cultural Relations with the USSR. And I'm happy to address the same topic today. And I'd like to thank the Marx Memorial Library for the opportunity to give this talk, as well as the support from the present incarnation of Society for Cultural Relations. According to accounts of that meeting, Maurice Dobb addressed a gathering of over 250, here I quote, distinguished people, members of the diplomatic corps, academic and public life, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Tonight, no doubt, lurking behind the screen in front of me are equally distinguished people. But now there are no diplomatic representatives of the former Leninist states of the USSR or Eastern Europe. They no longer exist. And this difference indicates how the world has changed in my lifetime. And it provides another important dimension to the revolutionary movements precipitated by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Lenin has always been a controversial political figure who has aroused deep feelings of loyalty among his followers, and hostility from his opponents. In the West, the tone is critical and hostile, Richard Pipes and his Russian associate described Lenin as a ruthless and manipulative leader who used terror, subversion, and persecution to achieve his goals. And this is indicative of Western and many current Russian interpretations of Lenin. Marxists have always been divided about Lenin. And this has a long history going back before the October Revolution, with criticisms by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Kautsky. Marxists sympathetic to the socialist states have had a more positive view of Lenin's work. Lukács, as early as 1924, described Lenin as the greatest thinker to have been produced by the revolutionary working class movement since Marx. In the 1970s, the success of Soviet developments and Soviet-supported anti-colonial movements led many Western Marxists to evaluate positively Lenin's ideas, policies, and the achievement of Leninist regimes. In the 21st century, writers such as Lars Lee and Slavoj Žižek provide favorable appraisals. Žižek calls for a return to Lenin, to repeating in the present worldwide conditions the Leninist gesture of reinventing the revolutionary project in the conditions of imperialism and colonialism. Western and current Russian critics are wrong, however, to depict Lenin as a man solely motivated to avenge his brother, who was hanged by the Tsar, and to attain power by any means. He was a serious student of the social dynamics of society and of world politics. And in this talk, I will illustrate how Lenin's practice, that is, his strategy and call for action, grew out of and were predicated on Russia and its place in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. While his method of analysis is still relevant, his particular policies have to be seen in relation to a historically determined combination of economic and political structures and events on a world scale. And in this context, we should consider whether Lenin's approach has any contemporary relevance. Lenin's greatest contribution to Marxist theory were the interrelated concepts which formed the theory of socialist revolution. So the next slide. He developed an understanding of capitalism in the context of Imperial Russia with 5 substantive components. These 5 elements should be seen in combination, and as such, they may be regarded as Lenin's theory of socialist revolution. There is first, based on Marxist laws of historical materialism, the idea of the uneven development of capitalism. Second, a theory of leadership and mobilization embodied in a political party promoting socialist revolution. Third, a theory of imperialism, which describes the stage of capitalism in the early 20th century. Fourth, a means to enforce the socialist conquest of political power through the dictatorship of the proletariat. Fifth, a vision of an alternative to capitalism, a communist society. Each of these components was developed by Lenin on its own, and in Lenin's works, there is no analysis synthesizing these components. Lenin went beyond Marx and Engels by combining political economy with geopolitics and a sociological understanding of the social structure. He devised a revolution-making party and the strategy for the defense and installation of socialism after the revolution. He formulated an emancipatory image of communism. And in this lecture, I can only deal with a limited number of these topics. The first major shift from 19th century Marxist thinking is that the developing and exploited countries, Russia being the classic case, have moved to the center of the theory of socialist revolution. And the focus of revolution moved from Western Europe to the East. This was legitimated by the theory of combined and uneven development and imperialism. As an integral part of Lenin's thought, it links the socialist revolution in the East to consequences of capitalism in the West. For Lenin, capitalism was international. A socialist revolution would take place at the weakest link in the capitalist chain, and this was to be found in countries undergoing the transition to capitalism. The contradictions of capitalism were greatest in the semi-peripheries of world capitalism. Lenin pointed to the importance of different trajectories of capitalist development, Advanced forms of capitalist economy in a proletariat, that is workers producing surplus value, arise in a country with a weak national bourgeoisie, dependent on an autocratic, pre-capitalist political formation. The national bourgeoisie was unable to complete the bourgeois revolution. Consequently, the socialist movement has a positive role to play in the development of capitalism, to break the forms of feudal oppression. Lenin surmised that a stratum of the peasantry, those already with sufficient land to sell produce on the market, could produce an alliance with the urban proletariat against the autocracy to make a democratic bourgeois revolution. And this would be followed by an alliance with the poor peasantry, which would be the social base for a socialist revolution. Lenin's strategy then revised Marxist analysis. In a country experiencing early imperialist capitalist development, where the national bourgeoisie was weak, the proletariat had the mission to lead the bourgeois democratic revolution to secure the best possible outcome for the working class. And this was a tactic of the Bolsheviks in the 1905 revolution. But at that time, others, such as Trotsky in Results and Prospects and later in Permanent Revolution, went further. As Trotsky put it in Permanent Revolution, the matter could not rest there at the bourgeois stage. Having reached power, the proletariat would be compelled to encroach even more deeply upon the relationships of private property in general, that is, to take the road of socialist measures. The Russian bourgeois democratic revolution, then, does not stop at the democratic stage, which goes over to socialist measures and to war against reaction from without. At this time, however, Lenin did not agree with the merging of the bourgeois and socialist revolutions. In 1905, he saw the two as distinct. The socialist revolution would follow the capitalist revolution. The revolutions had different constellations of class forces. Already he considered that the socialist revolution could only be completed, and here I quote, with the proletarians of Europe. For the task of carrying out the democratic revolution in Russia, he said, our ally is the petty bourgeois peasantry of Russia. For the task of kindling the socialist revolution in Europe, it is the proletariat of other countries. By October 1917, the situation had changed. Lenin's view now was that a Russian revolution led by the Bolsheviks would be paralleled in Western Europe. If we succeed, the revolutionary conflagration will spread to Europe. The European worker, languishing under bourgeois reaction, will rise and show us how it is done. And then the revolutionary upsurge in Europe will have a repercussive effect upon Russia and will convert an epoch in a few revolutionary years into an era of several revolutionary decades. In the socialist revolution, then, the ally of the Russian working class, and here he included the rural poor peasants, would be the international working class. Lenin's concept of revolution was bounded by an understanding of capitalism in its imperialist form, which led to a geopolitical shift in the locus of the socialist revolution. At its imperialist stage, competition between the major capitalist powers led to the division of the world and also to world war. Lenin's theory linked empirically the rise of capitalism in a post-feudal society, that is Russia, to the imperialist nature of capitalism and its effect on the class structure of the core and peripheral countries. Imperialism had four major implications. So the next slide, 5A. First, imperialism exploits the developing countries, which leads concurrently to the development of capitalism in the dependent countries and improvements to living standards of the workers in the home countries. Second, the working classes in the advanced capitalist countries support their governments and their claims to colonies and areas of influence. Third, the class struggle had to be understood in an international perspective. Exploitation on a world scale transcends national boundaries. Fourth, the collapse of the world system of capitalism would snap first at its weakest link, and Russia here was a paradigmatic case. The revolution in Russia would be the spark which would set off the proletarian revolution in the West. The evolution of imperialism sets the preconditions for the collapse of capitalism. But how would the revolution occur? And here we turn to the third strand of Lenin's theory. Lenin made a decisive shift in Marxist analysis. He developed Marxist praxis. He recognized that a new social formation would not spontaneously grow out of capitalism. Human action coordinated by a political party was necessary to move society from capitalism to socialism. While social democratic parties in Europe might promote revolutionary policies within the parameters of capitalism, Lenin proposed a revolution-making party whose task it was to bring about a socialist revolution. Its mission was to lead the working class as part of the bourgeois democratic revolution, and then for the party to act as a dictatorship of the proletariat in the period of the transition to communism. The reasoning, both at a theoretical level and at that of political action, presents major divisions between supporters and critics of Lenin. The success of the October Revolution in Russia in 1917 changed the focus of the transition to socialism from the advanced Western countries to the rising countries of the East, first in the USSR and then in the People's Republic of China. What did Lenin get right, and in what respects has history shown his thinking to be wrong or incomplete? Bear in mind that what was appropriate for Russia in October 1917 is not necessarily the right way to proceed in 2020, and I'll return to this later. Right, let's have slide 7A. Then Lenin's what he getting right and what he got wrong. Firstly, Lenin's analysis of the social structure of development in Russia as an exemplar of developing colonial countries was correct. He correctly pointed to the weakness of the domestic bourgeoisie in Russia as a revolutionary force. He widened the definition of the working class from the proletariat to include all the working population, and this included the working population of the peasantry who were working mainly on their own account. These participated in the democratic revolution. But while he correctly considered the rich and middle peasants to be class groups which would support the overthrow of the autocracy and the institution of a property-owning bourgeoisie, he misjudged the middle peasants' adverse disposition towards a collectivist economic structure. The October Revolution led not only to the consolidation of privately managed peasant lands, but to a considerable growth in the number of middle and poor peasant households. That is to say, peasants who were working on their own or working on their own and selling some of their produce in the market. Attachment to the land they possessed was much greater than their support for the kind of collective ownership proposed by the Bolsheviks after the revolution. Consequently, the Bolsheviks, who even in 1917 lacked peasant support, when in power faced systemic opposition from the villages. The Bolshevik regime was seriously threatened, and these class divisions prolonged the dictatorship of the proletariat. Secondly, Lenin's proposal for centralized political organization, which was necessary to further the interests of the opposition to the Tsarist autocracy, were correct. Under the conditions of police surveillance, a party of a new type with a democratic form of policy making and centralized organization and control was a practical necessity in Tsarist Russia. The role of the mass media in the form of an all-Russian newspaper as an educative instrument, as well as a coordinating one, was necessary and effective. Where Lenin failed was not to recognize sufficiently the dysfunctional effect of state and party bureaucratic control, which became apparent in the period after the seizure of power in Russia. While organizational forms similar to democratic centralism had also been adopted by other social democratic parties, such as the Social Democratic Party in Germany after 1917, in Russia, the political administration reconstituted the political forms of Tsarist Russia into a statist political bureaucracy, applying democratic centralism as a form of organization to all associations in society under the hegemony of the party was a consequence of the need to maintain power, not a process acceptable to socialism. Thirdly, Lenin's geopolitical analysis of imperial monopoly capitalism correctly drew attention to the inherent conflict between hegemonic capitalist and dependent states. He saw the contradictions between the positive effects of economic development concurrent with the economic exploitation of the dependent countries. Lenin's political focus on capitalism's weakest links and the successful seizure of power in 1917 shifted the national and socialist revolutions to the colonial world. However, Lenin misjudged the national, political, and social relationships between classes in the developed capitalist states. His belief, held as late as October 1920, that the October Revolution had created, and here I quote, a new zone of proletarian revolution in Germany and England was grossly misjudged. Lenin earlier had underestimated the readiness of the leaders of Western social democratic parties to participate in the First World War, and he overestimated the likelihood of mobilizing the working class, the Western working classes, against the war and against their old governments. Fourthly, Lenin noted the dislocating effects of the First World War on the capitalist powers. It was a decisive factor in disrupting the Russian economy and society and created a wide range of political strata predisposed to revolution. He correctly analyzed the political situation in Europe in 1917, and he showed immense courage and political leadership in carrying out a successful national revolution. Slide 7b. In the April theses, he defined the steps necessary to carry out a socialist revolution. And in State and Revolution, he defined an alternative form that a socialist society would take. This again was a great achievement. Sixthly, he was mistaken to believe, however, that it would break world capitalism. Imperial capitalism could not be likened, as Lenin put it, to a continuous chain with weak and strong links. It's more like a very large tree. Cutting off thin and old decayed branches does not kill it, but stimulates growth. Capitalism experienced crises. It did not collapse and has continued to expand and grow. Eventually, in the late 20th century, it overpowered the Soviet Union as well as the East European socialist states. Seventhly, Lenin erred in his understanding of the working classes in the advanced capitalist states. Despite systemic economic crises, capitalist societies maintained high levels of social and political integration. Even in the early 20th century, the Western working classes remained integrated into capitalist society. And this attachment was neither broken by the suffering endured during the First World War, nor by the victory of the Bolsheviks in Russia. As Lenin himself had argued, their elemental predisposition was for improvement of conditions. The crisis of the war, economic depression, and the Bolshevik seizure of power did not create a socialist consciousness. The monopoly of power claimed after the 1917 revolution was politically necessary to keep the Bolsheviks in power. However, the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, as Lenin called it, was something quite different from that anticipated by Marx and Engels and the European socialist movement at that time. The dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry became much more and lasted longer than what one might have expected from a transitionary form of power. It became, as Michel Brie has put it, an instant decoupled from the will of the members of the proletariat and their actions. It led to excessive repression due to the quantitative and qualitative weakness of the Russian working class. The absence of a proletarian revolution in the West undermined the legitimacy of attempting a socialist revolution in Russia. How then should we evaluate Lenin's policies today? His prognosis is far removed from conditions of the 21st century world politics to warrant Zizek's call for any repeat. Any reinvention of his policies must avoid reinventing the wheel when technology already has produced jet engines. The question to be answered is whether there is anything in Lenin's theoretical and practical approach that can be renewed, and that we can add to our understanding or contribute to political strategy and politics. Moreover, we need to address what has to be modified and even rejected in Lenin's politics. Lenin's own opinion was that the new views should be substituted for old when the latter are no longer true. Lenin is not exempt from being superseded by history. We have to avoid applying to a post-industrial society policies which are appropriate for a peasant-based country shaped by the chaotic conditions of defeat in a major war. It is not Lenin's policies which are relevant today, but his underlying methodology. Lenin addressed the evolution of capitalism in a historical context as an evolving mode of production. He defined the social and human forces which were propelling political change, and he sought to challenge them, channel them to promote the socialist cause. His theorizing has the following framework, which you'll see here on slide 9. Firstly, the definition of human values and objectives derived from historical materialism, a practice of human action to make a transition from capitalism to socialism. He had a vision in State and Revolution of a socialist society which would realize real individual freedom. Secondly, he had an analysis of the changing structure of capitalism, its class composition, forms of ownership, the role of the state, its territorial dimensions. Thirdly, he had a recognition of the importance of political consciousness and the need for an alliance for political class forces, how social class stratification promotes political alignments. Fourthly, he understood the nature of political agency, that is, the form that a socialist challenge should and could take, the process of the transition to socialism. And fifthly, he had an understanding of the geopolitical power structures, the imperial stage of capitalism, grouping of states, international organizations, global business and globalized states, identification of the weakest links in the international order. These points I've made then bring out the comprehensive nature of Lenin's worldview, the interdependence of the economic, social and political factors, and the interaction of national and geopolitical events, which precipitated a successful seizure of power. Lenin was a philosopher, economist, sociologist, and a political leader all in one. Unlike Western sociologists of revolution, who explain revolutions by categorizing the features of revolution, and unlike political activists such as people like Russell Brand, for example, who propose revolution with only a thin sociological understanding of how it might come about, Lenin not only considers the factors predisposing actors to revolution, but also utilizes them to bring about revolution. Lenin looked to historical materialism to provide the goals of and the means to action, Historical materialism is predicated on the understanding of societies in motion. It is teleological in the sense that political practice is designed to produce a socialist society. It links political action to social class forces to bring about social change. It defines an alternative type of socialist society, a mode of production. In State and Revolution, Lenin envisaged a classless democratic society which would transcend the democratic forms of capitalist society. Here, he idealizes the socialist alternative. Lenin prepared a successful uprising in Russia. Post-October realized a Soviet model of a modernizing transitional social formation. Despite its inadequacies, imperfections, and repression, Soviet power achieved a workers' state which operated without private property and market relations. A planned society and a welfare state were qualitatively different from, an alternative to, and more equitable than liberal capitalism. It was a successful industrial civilization, and it became a beacon for other rising colonial states. These were some of the achievements of Leninism. Soviet power, however, did not defeat capitalism as a world system. Lenin's strategy to capture state power through an insurrection was feasible only under exceptional circumstances. In October 1917, Russia experienced a conjuncture of world war, internal political and economic collapse, and a geopolitical vacuum. October 1917 was premature as a socialist revolution. Lenin's understanding of the Western working class was incomplete, and he grossly misjudged the conditions for socialist revolution on a European scale. Today, we have to consider the organic metamorphosis of capitalism to socialism, the contradictions created by the post-industrial division of labor, the rise of new forms taken by the ruling classes and the working classes, and problems posed by a more integrated political system. Even more relevant in the 21st century has been the removal of ruling communist parties, the dismantling of the planned economies of the European socialist states, and the move to markets and private ownership in all of them, with the addition of communist China. Also, the former socialist and social democratic parties of Western Europe have dwindled in membership and electoral support and lack any pretense of projecting any countervailing power, both ideologically and politically. Any return to Lenin has to address what holds the chain together. The broken links which later formed the Soviet Union have been reforged. Russia is back in the capitalist loop. The question now is, how would Lenin have addressed breaking the strongest links, those where capitalism is most developed? Whereas Marx in the Communist Manifesto considered that capitalism would dig its own grave, Lenin pointed out that the ruling classes were not going to lie down in it. The ruling classes have been able to manage the adverse effects of competitive capitalism. What would be Lenin's political strategy today? Right, 9A. Lenin suggests an answer in his discussion of Britain in 1920, when he said, "The fundamental law of revolution, which has been confirmed by all revolutions, and especially by all three Russian revolutions in the 20th century, is as follows. It is only when the lower classes do not want to live in the old way, and the upper classes cannot carry on in the old way, that the revolution can triumph. It follows that for a revolution to take place, it is essential first that a majority of the workers should fully realize that revolution is necessary, and that they should be prepared to die for it. Second, that the ruling classes should be going through a governmental crisis which weakens the government and makes it possible for the revolutionaries to overthrow it. Neither of these criteria appears to be probable in the foreseeable future in the advanced Western countries. Lenin also recognized that revolution could not be forced. He exposed ritualistic revolutionary protest, which he condemned as an infantile disorder. He criticizes, and here I quote, left communists who seek revolution when they lack support. He cautioned against believing that a vanguard of revolutionaries could alone make a successful revolution. In 1921, he declared that, and here I quote, the greatest danger to the genuine revolutionary is that of exaggerated revolutionism, ignoring the limits and conditions in which revolutionary methods are appropriate and can be successfully employed. The broad masses of the working people have to support a major change. There has to be a mass sentiment favoring revolutionary action. Lenin was also aware that there was no unique way to socialism. He pointed out in left-wing communism that policies have to be detailed in each country in conformity with the specific character of its economics, politics, culture, and national composition. Such a conclusion is still true and requires renewal. Slavoj Žižek appealed to reinvent Lenin's call to revolution in the conditions of imperialism and colonialism is much more challenging now than it appeared in October 1917. Since the early 20th century, capitalism has suffered regular economic crises, but there's been no surrender by the governing classes. The hegemonic power of the West, articulated by the United States, has matured. The post-socialist societies of Eastern Europe and the USSR have rejoined the capitalist world. Even the Communist Party of China has moved to markets and the acceptance of corporate property. European social democratic and socialist parties are in significant decline. The lower classes have not rejected capitalism, but have sought to benefit of consumer societies. Current left-wing critics demand justice and equality, but there is no alternative vision of living in a new post-capitalist way. In the sociological imagination, competing elites have replaced antagonistic classes. Cultural and identity politics have occluded historical materialism. Contemporary movements such as white supremacy, Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, or Occupy St. Paul's Cathedral lack coherent alternative ideologies. The call for civil rights and justice by contemporary social movements is not a call for the installation of socialism, but it's a call for a more acceptable, just, liberal, democratic version of capitalism. It is a leftist critique, not a socialist one. And in this respect, Lenin positively endorsed the emancipation of exploited peoples and subaltern nations within states, such as Ireland, before partition, and the former slave population in the United States. He saw them correctly as part of a bourgeois democratic liberation movement. Lenin has to be renewed in the context of other forms of discrimination, domination and oppression, bureaucratic and personal power, patriarchy, ethnicity, and credentialism. They have to be considered in the context of economic exploitation, which Lenin emphasized. Lenin already in 1923 recognized the absence of class consciousness. In his last article, Better Fewer but Better, he referred to the class truce in the European capitalist states. We may go even further. In the last 50 years has witnessed the movement from a class truce to a class peace. The reason for this can't be considered here in any detail, They include direct and indirect suppression of critical political forces through the law, the growing power of the mass media, major changes in capitalist economic development and their geographical location, faults in the leadership of countervailing parties, and significant improvements in material and cultural living standards. In the 21st century, the transnational character of economic, commercial, and media corporations and political military organizations severely limit the sovereignty of states. State nationalization of major corporations is obstructed by transnational corporations and organizations and prompts military intervention by hegemonic states. Moreover, a socialist alternative to be effective requires multinational support. The proposal of a Leninist party of a new type to instigate a revolution and then to act as a dictatorship was possible in Tsarist Russia. Under conditions of globalized capitalism, this is possible for right-wing parties with international backing, but it is highly improbable for socialist parties. Whatever democracy's many failings, advocating a dictatorship of the working class now would have no public appeal, and it would be a powerful propaganda tool for the dominant media. One may have to have forms of democracy without socialism, but one can't have socialism without democracy. As a transitionary process, the Chinese Communist Party, which did have support of the peasantry, adopted a more credible approach when in 1947 it was declared that the People's Republic of China was a new democratic or a people's democratic state. Now political advance can only be achieved by democratic means, which include extra-parliamentary forms of democracy. Today, we require an analysis of the contradictions of an increasingly economically coordinated capitalism with strongly integrated economic, media, ideological and political elites. On the one side, the transnational coordination of capitalism by corporations, international institutions, and a dominant transnational capitalist class supersedes the imperialist national form of monopoly capitalism. On the other, the reterritorialization and greater differentiation of the working classes severely weaken any spontaneous development of class consciousness. On such a stage, any transition to socialism could take place under quite different and more challenging conditions than those known to Lenin. What is to be done now requires revision and a focus on states locked into global capitalism. Imperialism calls for a new analysis of global geopolitics. In this context, what has to be invented is a political strategy of class alliances and political policies to win the battle for socialist democracy on a transnational scale. Lenin posed what is now the wrong question. The problem now is not how to break capitalism at its weakest link, but how it might be transformed at its strongest links. The political mechanism of democratic parliamentary struggles and a piecemeal transition to socialism have to be addressed. Socialist parties have to adopt and execute transformative policies rather than trying to be revolution-making parties. The task of socialists is to win the competitive democratic struggle and to extend democratic control over economic and transnational corporations and organizations. Lenin was fully aware that a physical armed revolution could lead to disaster. There is another side, however, to Lenin, which is undervalued. He strongly advocated participation in parliamentary procedures, both in Russia before 1917 and in England in the 1920s. He also advocated participation in the political institutions of capitalism. In his discussion of the Paris Commune, for example, he endorsed involvement in a bourgeois government and declared that under certain conditions, such involvement was even obligatory. The current political problem for socialists is to prevent Parliament becoming a limited parliamentary socialism, compromising socialist objectives. Socialist challenges are now wider than parliamentary democracy and take the form of raising levels of economic democracy through employee participation, extending and legitimating state ownership, enabling state control of the movement of capital, and projects to transform the financial sector into a public utility. Politically, representative democracy can be strengthened by the use of referendums and reliance on the recall and deselection of elected representatives. Let us not forget that Lenin called for all public servants to receive salaries not higher than the average wage of manual workers' wages. In foreign affairs, policies to promote peace, nuclear disarmament, and economic development can be based on an effective United Nations. Let me then conclude by suggesting some answers to the question, what is to be done in the 21st century? And now, next slide. The first renewal would be to reinvent class politics. To follow Lenin would be to transcend the current emphasis on identity politics and diversity, which justifiably promotes the rights of minority and marginalized groups. The focus of cultural and income inequalities between people should move to inequalities between classes. The objective is not only to reduce inequalities between occupational groups and to promote the upward mobility of the working class, but to abolish class divisions. A class analysis would include a definition of countervailing forces and class alliances, taking account of the proletariat, the precariat, the self-employed, industrial workers, service employees, the military and police, the unemployed and underemployed, differences between the private and public sectors, alliances with the small and medium business sectors. The second challenge is to reinvent ways to change people's political dispositions or their consciousness, to shift away from cultural identity politics and to renew socialist critique. Lenin's idea of the socialist newspaper as a means of education and organization was a 20th century innovation. It has to be augmented now by social electronic media. The third revision of Lenin lies in taking account of the territorial redivision of class space. No longer are the dominating classes located in a single nation state. Ruling classes are transnational. The capitalist class includes not only transnational corporations, but also international coordinating organizations. A renewed concept of imperialism must recognize the shift to globalized capitalism. The transnational corporations, regional associations of states, and international organizations in which nation states are embedded. Fourthly, Lenin in the 21st century would shift the focus from breaking the weakest link to breaking or dividing capitalism's strongest links. The movement from capitalism to socialism will not occur at the semi-periphery of the world system, but in its most developed forms and the strongest states. It calls for examination of changes in the level of productive forces, how current technological change leads to new contradictions and foreseen by Lenin. Politically, it requires a move away from revolution-making national parties to the promotion of democratically achievable, transformative socialist policies. The current world order includes new divisions in the system of world states. Does China, for example, present an ascendant power which might break the capitalist chain in a way that the USSR could not? Remember, the first paragraph of the Constitution of the Communist Party of China, published in 2017, declares that the party's highest ideal and ultimate goal is the realization of communism. A fifth revision requires a return to democratic forms of economic and political participation to advance a socialist program. This means winning the parliamentary battle and extending democratic forms to economic and social organizations and civil society associations. The sixth renewal is to reinstate the ideals of socialism. Any alternative involves a struggle between minds which define ends as much as one between means. Lenin had a conviction born of the Enlightenment that human action could bring progress and lead to a fully democratic society without exploitation. He emphasized that all human life would be qualitatively better under conditions of socialism. Such a society would realize a process of what Marx called self-actualization, the achievement of real individual freedom. This is a vision which has been lost and has to be renewed in terms which have a popular and not just a philosophical resonance. So finally, a return to Lenin is not to adopt his policies, but to reinvent a socialist vision derived from the expectation of the Enlightenment and Marxist analysis of capitalism.
Thank you so much, David. That was absolutely fascinating. It's covered absolutely loads. So we've already got quite a few questions coming in. If you don't mind, I'll just fire away straight away, shall I? Are you happy to take a couple at a time, or?
Just tell me one.
Okay. So we've got the first question we've got is from Kate Clark. To what extent did Lenin's failure?
Hang on, let me just find yours on the.
That's all right. I'm putting it through to the chat to you, but
I've got hundreds of them on here.
No, it's all right. I've just sent it direct to you, but I'll read it out as well.
Okay.
To what extent?
Wait a minute. How can I find it then?
If you just select the chat icon,
I selected that, but
it should be the first thing that pops up, because I've just sent it to you privately. To what extent did Lenin's failure to correctly understand the state's bureaucratic system and the need to transform it lead to the mistakes and shortcomings of the economic system of the USSR in the decades since Lenin?
Could you say that again?
To what extent did Lenin's failure to correctly understand the state's bureaucratic system and the need to transform it lead to the mistakes and shortcomings of the economic system of the USSR in the decades since Lenin?
Yes, well, I think the the answer is posed in the question that the system which occurred in the economic system and political system which developed in the Soviet Union was not really made by the leaders of the Socialist Party. It was largely inherited from the system which existed in the pre-socialist social formation. And because of the backwardness of the society, and because the Soviet Union had to develop its own means of production, it utilized the bureaucratic structures which were there before. My feeling is that Lenin was aware of these problems, but effectively it was quite unable to control the kinds of system which one might expect under socialism. So in other words, I would come back to my general view of what happened was that the situation wasn't appropriate to devise a socialist form of economy at the time in terms of what he was talking about in State and Revolution, for example. What the Soviet planners had to do, and which is what they did do, was to copy the forms of advanced organization, which was the case in the capitalist states. So in other words, the actual structure, the way in which the society went forward wasn't completely under the control of the political leadership. So it was a continuation of many things which actually went on. I think that Lenin probably did have some understanding of what was going on, but I don't think he fully realized what some of the problems were. But again, when you look at what the alternatives were, it was really quite difficult to provide any kind of sort of socialist development in the Soviet Union at that time. I don't know whether that answers the question.
Thanks, David. We've got one from Comrade Steph, who's drawing specifically on the current pandemic and the current economic climate. And he asks, will the profound and global impact of the COVID-19 crisis, like the First World War and Spanish flu, contribute in creating new conditions for revolutionary movements, considering that the workers and middle class we put in proletarian or sub-proletarian conditions, as well as becoming clearer, hopefully, that the selfish bourgeois social model based on profit is not sustainable?
Well, I can tell you what the line which I've tried to argue in this paper, in that the answer would be, well, there may be conditions there for these changes, but there is effectively no revolutionary movement out there. There's no way in which if people effectively wanted to do this, that it will actually be attained. How is this going to be attained? What are the social movements? So my feeling is, the answer is probably not. My answer is that certainly the advanced and non-advanced states will eventually overcome the what problems there are. Mm-hmm. I don't see any evidence at all of any major revolutionary development taking place at present.
Okay, thank you. And then we've got one from Colin here, which is again about another kind of current crisis. Colin asks, to what extent does the impending crisis of climate change create new conditions of revolutionary opportunity, demanding Leninist-style analysis and action?
Well, I'm not sure that, you know, it depends what you would mean by a Leninist style of things. I mean, I think possibly there is, it depends to what extent the environmental conditions can be overcome by the existing institutions of power and what the alternative is. As I see it, there is no effective alternative equivalent to the kind of socialist movement which occurred in the early 20th century. So what one could say is, yes, it would be nice if something like that would happen, but where is the social movement? Where is the social movement in place to actually attain it? So I can see that there are some preconditions there, which a kind of an environmental mode of production could lead to something which would be quite separate. But what Lenin did was he provided a means by which you get from here to there. And I don't see what movements there are leading to the movement from the equivalent to one mode of production to another. What I see out there, even with the critical groups, are attempts to get governments and international organizations to change their particular policies. It may be necessary, if they don't work, it may be necessary to move to a different mode of production, but this would require a quite different kind of political movement to what already exists.
Mm-hmm. Related to this need for a movement, I've got a question here on political education from Harsif Baines. He asks, on the theme of political education, how do you view the proposal by Lenin for theory and struggle being the essence for working class emancipation?
Say that again.
How do you view the proposal by Lenin for theory and struggle being the essence for working class emancipation?
Well, yeah, I think that Lenin, well, I think there's two things. Firstly, that the socialist movement has to act to bring consciousness to its constituency. That is one thing, but there also has to be something there. And I think that this is where critics of Lenin would come into place, they would say, well, you can't simply bring these ideas. And I think Lenin himself would say this. There has to be a predisposition on the part of citizens that they want some kind of fundamental change. And I suppose this also applies to the earlier question. It's no use simply elites having these particular beliefs. These elites will attempt to manipulate the existing system to change them in a sort of reformist way, and will keep the existing institutions and the existing forms of property in place. So that the education does become extremely important, firstly in educating people in terms of the level of class consciousness. And I think the other thing which Lenin said with respect to the newspaper of educated meeting is the way in which political organizations can work. The political organizations themselves don't have to be inert, but political organizations need to have some kind of theories that we aren't just concerned with the mechanisms by which power takes place, but with what the objectives of power are. And this requires some kind of intellectual effort. So the educational process is not simply due to political leadership, as it were, telling the masses what they should believe, but the formation of particular ideologies, alternatives, which people need to be predisposed to believe those kinds of ideologies. We don't have anything like this now. We don't have any socialist television channel, for instance. We have one really minor newspaper for the whole of Europe, effectively. I mean, there are other weeklies and so on. But the difference in terms of the level of education in its wider sense is quite disproportionate. And so that the answer would be, yes, if you can have a number of socialist television channels, for instance, they don't have to be socialist with a capital S, but they have to have a different kind of view, a different world view. They have to then to be able to relate to people's predispositions to create some sort of alternative system. Yes, that would be very important, but we're moving away from the newspaper. The newspaper isn't possibly going to do that. You have to look now at the ways in which modern media, social media particularly, electronic media is moving, and look in that direction to look for forms of education in a general way, which give people a different worldview, a different way of looking at the world. And unless you have that, you won't have a major movement which will change any significant change. You may have marginal changes. You may even, with the Black Lives Matter and stuff, you're not going to get any major change in this. You are going to get different kinds of structures, more justice, for instance, undoubtedly. But it's not going to make a major change of the system. So this is what Lenin was concerned with. And Lenin's idea was that in the condition, certainly in the condition of Russia, you could create a system in which people would look at an alternative. Why was that? Because, of course, they were in an autocratic czarist system. People working 10, 12, 15 hours a day. They had no social security at all. They had really effectively nothing to lose. People were out there in the countryside. And the same happened to the workers in the towns. So he saw that there was a large group of people out there, and in the the elections in 1917, he got nearly 10 million votes. 10 million people voted for the Bolshevik Party. That's a lot of people to vote for a revolutionary party. How many would you get in the UK?
Thank you, and Harsif and Colin have both come back thanking you profusely for your answers to these questions. Jonathan White has come in with a couple of questions on historical materialism. He asks, I think Professor Lane's emphasis on Lenin's understanding of historical materialism and the importance of concrete analysis of societies in motion, both nationally and at a world level, is vital. How might Lenin have used his historical materialism to think about the world role of China in building some non-capitalist relations of production and the questioning of the most financialized versions of capitalism as a consequence of the shocks posed by the pandemic to the global economy?
Yeah, well, Lenin did look following the revolution. what Lenin did specify that socialism would move to the east, and he did, in fact. In counting the success of the October Revolution, he did point to what he believed would be developments in China and in India. So I think that now, yes, China does provide an alternative, or it could provide an alternative. The question is, though, which way is China going? And we aren't really sure about that. I mean, you can say, well, what does historical materialism show? And you could say, I mean, you could say, yes, China could be in a position in which it could move towards a socialist type of society. But there are the pessimists, of course, who see the development of markets, the development of corporate power in China, the role of finance in China, the growing internationalization of China, as moving not really in the direction of communism, of socialism, but rather moving towards a kind of Chinese socialism with capitalist characteristics. So I think the answer to the question is yes, that there is this possibility, and I think that that's true, that China is in a very good position to provide some alternative. And I think I did mention that in my talk. I think that is a real alternative. A lot, of course, will depend on what happens in China in the next year or so.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Are you happy to take one or two more? We've got one here just come through. What would be an effective approach to raise class consciousness, particularly in a post-socialist country such as Romania, where the socialist state was only overthrown 3 decades ago, but where anti-communist sentiments are on the rise amongst the youth?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's back to the question of, you know, how you change people's predispositions. I think in the East European countries, you've got a very high level of dissatisfaction with the system. The question is, which way are they going to go? Are they going to go for more capitalism? Are they going to go for a more developed form of capitalism? And you can see this in some of the demonstrations which occur, and things like the so-called colored revolutions. I mean, these seem to be taken over, not in terms of a criticism of capitalism, but a criticism of a particular kind of crony capitalism. But there's no real alternative of moving towards a socialist system. At least it's not very obvious. And I think that this possibly is one way in which these societies could go, but it needs to have some alternative ideology, particularly among the younger generation, to see an alternative, not an alternative type of capitalism, but an alternative to capitalism. I think what you have now in many of the post-communist countries is what type of capital, an alternative capitalism, rather than an alternative to capitalism. So what people effectively want is to move towards what they see as a more ideal kind of, ideal would be something like Germany, for instance, or like Denmark. So how you overcome that is a real problem. I mean, it's a problem which affects all the capitalist countries. And to say, well, it can only be changed if you have a major change in terms of relation to the means of production. That would be the Leninist way out. But this requires an intellectual development in the first place. And secondly, then, it needs the formation of some kind of major political movement in order to get these groups together. And this, I think, is where the socialist movement essentially has failed. It's not managed to do this. again, if you look at the crises which have occurred since, say, 2007 onwards, there's been effectively no alternative strategy put forward. You look at most of the economic analysis, and what the economic analysis want is some way to patch up the system, to improve the system. And again, if you look in the East European countries, there's not a strong movement against the sort of corporate capitalism, the crony capitalism, the oligarchies which take place. They want to clean the system up. I mean, there are small groups, but they don't seem to have any particular resonance. And that's why I say, if you look at what Lenin's idea was, you have to get a movement. You have to define some particular objectives, and you have to have a system by which you can transmit these particular goals to the population as a whole. And hopefully out there will be people who will have some kind of resonance to this. That, I think, is what the problem is. If you can identify the problem, you can then identify some way of going to it. But again, the parameters now are so much more difficult to actually do this. The strength of the control of the mass media, for example, it's quite massive, and for smaller groups to overcome this, if they're going against the mass media, it's extremely difficult to actually do that, and it's led many people just effectively to give up, I think.
Thank you. We've got one more from Oliver, if that's all right. We've got what can be salvaged. Can Lenin's theory of imperialism and state monopoly capitalism be adapted to the 21st century world? Can these ideas be salvaged from Marxist-Leninist ideology?
You say that again?
Sorry. Can Lenin's theory of imperialism and state monopoly capitalism be adapted to the 21st century? Can these ideals be salvaged from Marxist-Leninist ideology?
Yeah, I think they can. I mean, I think that I think what I'm trying to say is that imperialism, the way in which Lenin defined imperialism, isn't quite the same, because Lenin was concerned with imperialism, which was based essentially on nation states. Although they were international companies, they weren't global companies in the sense that we now have global companies. You look at the ownership of British companies, for instance, and in terms of assets, something like a half or even more than half of the assets are foreign owned. So that it's not simply a matter of looking at the way in which national imperialism impinges on other countries. The whole thing becomes much more difficult when you've got global companies. It's much more difficult for individual states to actually get control of their own economies. Best example, this is Greece, for instance, in the its recent problems in the European Union and with global capitalism. It's quite difficult to actually overcome those problems because of the nature of ownership in the system. So in a way, what I'm saying is that Lenin pointed to these developments, which were at the beginning of the 20th century. What we now have to do is to look to say, well, we can't really transfer that kind of thinking to what we have now. But what we have to do is to look to see how is the present system different, and how can it somehow be altered? How far can it lead to some form of democratic control, for example? So that's how I would see it. It isn't simply a matter of conflict between states. It's a matter of ways in which people who are organized within states can get control, or can have some form of control or participation in international companies which are located in their states. But all this involves a rather different kind of politics to what we've been used to, and it needs a different way of thinking in bringing about change in this kind of globalized international system that we actually have. And I think I have really answered the question properly on the environmentalist stuff. The environmentalist stuff does bring this out, the nature of the global companies. But I think what people are now doing, they're working through states, and they're trying to work through the global institutions to change these particular things. But again, I think the problem here is it becomes much more difficult and much more sort of out of control of people, given the kind of globalized, transnational kind of economic and political system that we now have.
Thank you so much, David. And it's been such an illuminating evening, taking the time to reflect on Lenin's ideas and how the conditions in which he operated obviously differ so much today, but what we can salvage as well. It's been a real pleasure, and there's been so much more, I think, to really delve into. And thanks also for taking the time to answer all of these questions in so much detail. It's been really, really wonderful. So I want to say thank you both on behalf of the Marxmore Library and of course the SCRSS as well. And also a massive thanks to everybody who's logged on this evening, and particularly those who've got involved in the discussion. It's been really invaluable. We're going to be putting up this recording onto the Marxmore Library's website probably tomorrow morning, so you'll be able to look back at that. David, do you mind if I share your email address from that first slide? There's been a couple of people messaging me.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'll just pop that in the chat now. Just anything else to add? And I do urge everybody to please do take a look at the Marxmore Library and the SCRSS websites, because we do have other events coming up in the coming period. But thanks, David. It's been an absolute pleasure. Cheers.